And we are live. Showtime, folks. Good to see you, Romeo. Just Janice. Hi, Freddy Coco. Is that you? Your question? Sid? Oh, yeah, Sid, your messages. Sorry, guys, I'm just having an echo. Just fixing that. Is the echo still there? Guys, just want to check, is the echo still there? Just a bit of lag, StreamYard. So I'm just checking the chat. Is my mic good? Is it audible? Now, because I was hearing an echo at my end. Okay. Sweet. So let's just offer up prayers for the session. Ask the Holy Spirit to help me edify you, to keep me from speaking any kind of error or erring or making any kind of mistakes. If I do mistakes, help just check that you guys can just correct it in case if I do mistakes while typing or talking. I do that sometimes. And pray for the connection. You guys can also share and invite folks from your social media pages, because I have a feeling that I have been shadow banned. I'm just getting that feeling because people tell me, some of them, that they don't get notifications and whatnot. So just be aware. Okay. And who else is here? The use imperator. Said okay, we'll just wait for a few more people to show up. And then I could just start sharing my screen. So this is going to be part 3 of my series. And I guess it's going to be a 5-part series by the way things are. Okay. About a 5-part series. Originally, I wanted to do just to finish it in 1 part. Then I realized I have 2 parts. Then I noticed it would take me 3 parts. And now when I'm just looking up at all the evidence and the new arguments which have come forth, it could take about 5 parts to finish this series. So God willing, I'm going to do part 4 day after tomorrow and then leave part 5 out to sometime next week. Hey Jeremy, good to see you. All right, guys, I'll just share my screen. Share screen. System audio. Guys, can you see my screen? Hey, good evening, Murray. Good to see you. The screen good? Just present. Go to my slides for today. And once I'm done with this, I'll make these slides available to all of you from Dropbox or from Google Drive, God willing. Okay, this is what we had done last time. Belshazzar. Okay, now coming to today, we have linguistic objections. Now, anyone, what do you mean by linguistic objections or language? Hey, Edric, good to see you. So, linguistic objections have got to do with language. Now, the thing is, the book of Daniel, it's written in Aramaic and it's written in Hebrew. Okay, so this is one place where they say that Daniel is not unified since there are 2 different languages used. It's possible that maybe Aramaic was written at some point of time and Hebrew was written several years later. So this is the argument scholars want to come up with concerning Daniel. Now, in Daniel, according to manuscript copies and things like that. From chapter number 1 to chapter number 2, verse 3, this stuff is written in Hebrew. And then from chapter number 2, verse 4 to chapter number 7, it's written in Aramaic. And then again, from chapter number 8 to chapter number 12, it's written in Hebrew. So now scholars want to claim that maybe somebody started writing Daniel around 350 or 300 BC, and then they finished, and then another guy came in and finished writing it in 165 BC. So this is the claim. Are you getting this, guys? Just the objection. So now scholars want to assert the second claim. They want to say that maybe Hebrew would not have been understood by people at some point of time. Therefore, some chapters were written in Aramaic in the middle. That is chapter number 2, verse 4 to chapter number 7. So, which is really a stupid claim, to be really honest. It's really a very stupid claim. And now, on top of that, they want to assert another claim. They want to say that there are some Persian and Greek loan words used in the book to indicate a late date of composition. So now the book of Daniel, the actual manuscripts that they have some Persian and Greek loan words. And now that's why it's late. Because how can Daniel have Greek? Alexander the Great came and conquered Judea sometime around 330 BC, supposedly about 200 times after the time of Daniel. So they just want to say after Greek influence, these words have come in. Therefore, it has late dating. Now, they also want to say that whoever wrote Daniel is ignorant about the meaning of the word Chaldean. If you'll read your New Testament, if you're either reading it from the King James Version or say from the Dewey Rames Version, whenever you read books like Jeremiah or Isaiah, they will mention the word Babylonian to mean Chaldean. They'll always use the word Chaldean to refer to Babylonian. Now, they want to say that Daniel made a mistake because he uses the word Chaldean to denote astrologers or the wise men in the king's court. So, just to summarize in text, what are these guys smoking about? Two languages, Aramaic, Hebrew. So, supposedly composed over a period of time. They say maybe 150 years by 2 to 3 different authors. That's their claim. And on top of that, they say there are some Persian and Greek words which prove a later date, that is 165 BC. Why is the Greek argument strong according to them? Greek influence only came among the Jews after Alexander's conquest. So Daniel is late. And they also say that the author of Daniel was ignorant about the meaning of the word Chaldean. Why they want to say that? Because prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc., used that word to denote all Babylonian citizens. But Daniel uses that word. Daniel uses that word Chaldean to talk about the wise men say scholars, advisors, magicians, astrologers, etc. in the king's court, in say rather Nebuchadnezzar's court. So you see the objections. This is how they want to attack Daniel, by bringing these objections one after the other. So did you get the objections, guys? Did you get the objections? Just want to check. Are you guys there? I know that there's a delay. Okay, cool. I can see all the ones showing up. All right. So now let's take down these linguistic objections one by one. Now, how do these objections get refuted? Again, archaeology is on our side when it comes to these, to spitting on the scholars' faces. So we have discovered some Aramaic documents which date to the 5th century BC, written maybe about within 30 to 100 years of Daniel's time, very close. And now those Aramaic documents, what they say, it's written in uh, in court Aramaic or imperial Aramaic. So you could say something like, you have heard of the King's English or the Queen's English. So it was written in that kind of a format, the King's Aramaic. And there were two sets of different documents. One was called as the Elephant Papyri. They include both Greek and Aramaic documents, and they span across 100-year period. And then you also have court documents that date to BC 400. And the Aramaic used over there, it is very, very similar to the Aramaic used in Daniel. Okay, it is of that kind of level. Like, for example, if you have your English Bibles today, they are very different from King James or Dewey Reams, since King James and Dewey Reams were written about 400 years ago back in time. And if I'm looking at English Bibles even prior to that, we won't be able to even understand English. So it's the same thing over here. Not only is the language similar to that written around close to Daniel's time, but also the style of the language, it's official language. Okay. The other argument people used to bring forth about Aramaic is about Daniel's Aramaic is that Daniel's Aramaic is written in some Western Aramaic dialect. Therefore, it can't be the sorry, sorry. Therefore, it can't be the Aramaic used by the Babylonians. That was the claim made by the scholars. But after this document was discovered, it vindicated a lot of things. People thought, there were scholars who used to think, one of Daniel's friends, his Babylonian name was Abednego. Daniel had three friends in the court. One of those three friends, his name was Abednego. Now, what scholars used to claim that Abednego was a late corruption of the name, therefore Daniel was written late. But the discovery of these Aramaic documents proved that Abednego was an ancient Babylonian name, which dates closer to the time of Daniel, 5th or the 6th century BC, and therefore it is not a corruption. So, just some simple archaeology, and so much of it is just vindicated concerning the Aramaic of Daniel. Uh, did you get this point, guys? I just want to see in the chat. I know that there's a delay of about 10 to 15 seconds from StreamYard. Okay, so going further on, so that's the Aramaic objection rebutted. All right, cool. I can see the ones and the yeses. Now, the next set of objections about this Greek loanwords in Daniel. Now, they just make a big fuss about the Greek loanwords. Uh, Alexander came in 300 BC, he influenced the Jews, and since we find the usage of Greek inside of Daniel, therefore, this is a problem, and hence Daniel was written late. But what they don't try to tell you is there are only three Greek loanwords, and they just refer to musical instruments. Okay? They just refer to musical instruments, nothing more. And one scholar, he's a conservative scholar, Gleason Archer. He's actually written a book defending the Mosaic authorship of the Torah and refuting the JEPD hypothesis. You should read up his material. He's one of the top scholars out there on the conservative side. He points out that names of musical instruments generally remain fixed for many centuries. They almost remain the same. And according to another scholar, Peter Coxon, he says one of the loanwords for one of the instruments, which is called as kitara, it's derived from the Greek word kitaris. Now, this Ionic Greek word, it's even more ancient than the Attic Greek word. Kitara is the Attic Greek word, which has got to do with more modern Greek, whereas this word uh, kitaris, which is the Ionic Greek word, this is more ancient. So there is little chance that Hebrews of the 2nd century will be using Greek words of the 2nd century BC, because this Greek word is far older. This is one argument. But now, your scholars will still say, uh, it's still not good enough for us. Since there are still the presence of about three Greek words, who cares whether they are instruments or they are not instruments? It's not good enough. You have to prove how did the Jews know Greek before 500 BC or before 300 BC? How did the Jews know Greek? So, for that, we have archaeology again on our side. Now, once again, according to Gleason Archer, we know that during the time of Sargon, now Sargon was a king of the Assyrians, sometime during the time of Isaiah, they had Greek prisoners who were sold to them from Cyprus, Ionia, Lydia, and Sicilia. Okay. And also Greek poets such as say Alcaeus of Lesbos mentioned that his brother Antimenides served in the Babylonian army. This point is important. Now, what is 600 BC? 600 BC is Daniel's time period. 600 BC was about the time Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem. Actually, he took over it completely 14 years later, but around this time, Jerusalem was under his power as a vessel. Okay, so it is therefore evident that Greek mercenaries, Greek slaves, and Greek musical instruments were current in the Semitic Near East long before the time of Daniel. Okay, so even before Daniel, it's very much evident that these guys used to come play their musical instruments. The Greeks used to come and play their musical instruments in the Babylonian courts, and since Daniel was a court official, he would definitely be using these words to denote musical instruments. And here's another piece of archaeological evidence that Neo-Babylonian ration tablets published by E.F. Widener, Ionian carpenters and shipbuilders are mentioned among the recipients of nations from Nebuchadnezzar's commissionary, along with musicians from Ashkelon and elsewhere. There you go. That's why you can see musical instruments are the three Greek words, and that just makes complete sense. Archaeology reconciles with the Bible perfectly. Okay, so once again, This objection is out of the window. There's another scholar talking about this. Long before Alexander the Great, there is data to indicate contact between the Aegean Greeks and the ancient Near East. We may safely say that the presence of Greek words in an Old Testament book is not a proof of a Hellenistic date. If I'm saying Hellenistic date, it means a date after Alexander the Great, after 300 BC. In view of the abundant opportunities for contacts between the Aegean and the Near East before Alexander. And a liberal scholar, John C. John Collins, John J. Collins, a liberal scholar, he also admits that the musical instruments thing is weak evidence for a late Hellenistic dating for Daniel. This guy's a liberal scholar, even he gives in to this. All right. Now, the next objection. Another objection concerning the language. Now, they're saying that there are Persian loanwords used in Daniel. Now, they're saying since it's Persian loanwords used in Daniel, it has to be a later date. Why do you think that? I'll tell you why. So, I'll just draw the timeline a bit. So, like Judah was taken over by Babylon in 586 BC. That's the time of Daniel. Then Cyrus, or you could say Darius the Mede, one and the same person, defeated the Babylonians in say 539 BC. And then gave the Jews the permission later to return to their land and help build the temple. It was not just Cyrus, it was other kings after him as well, like Darius and Ahasuerus and all these guys. So when Jews started, by meaning to say the temple, the second temple, the temple which was there during Jesus' time, because what happened here, if you know your Old Testament history, taken over by Babylon, time of Daniel. So Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the temple of Solomon, or you could say the first temple. All right. Yeah, just Janus, they're wasting their time to disprove Daniel, but this is what it is. We need to have an answer ready just to show them how wrong they are and just to embarrass them. Because this is the nonsense which actually they teach at seminaries, and if you talk to priests these days, or even lots of theologians, even some Protestant theologians, and even a few Orthodox priests hold this view about Daniel, and they agree with the JEPD hypothesis, which is really disappointing. Okay. So when Jews started rebuilding the temple in 520 BC, all the way to 450 BC, they were supported by Persian kings. So they think, the scholars think, the use of Persian in Daniel would have been an influence which had come in later. Now, scholars, these same scholars, think that Daniel, rather parts of it, were first written in this time period, 300 to 250 BC, and then the rest was written between, say, 170 to 165 BC. They want to make these stupid claims, really shallow claims. Now, the, this is where they come into a problem concerning the 300 BC date. If they say Persian loanwords argument, it backfires. It clearly backfires against them. You know why? Persian words used in Daniel, they date too. They are Old Persian and they predate 300 BC. They are Old Persian words. So if you're talking about the Persian language, Old Persian is from ancient times until 300 BC. Then Mid Persian is from 300 BC to 900 AD, and Modern Persian 900 AD to now. Okay, and just to let you know, Modern Persian is also influenced somewhat from Arabic, following the conquest, the Islamic conquest of Persia. Just to let you guys know. That's why we have Modern Persian, because of the Abduls. And even the Persian script which we see now, which they call it as the Parsi script, it's based off on the Arabic script. Prior to that, it wasn't the case. Arab nationalism again to blame, because of Islam claiming that Arabic is God's only language. All right. Now, one more thing. There are about 30 Persian loanwords, and at least 20 of them are again administrative, meaning language spoken within the king's court. All right. Now, why is this an issue? Because Daniel served as a government official, administrator for both the Babylonians and the Medo Persians. That is the reason why. Yes, because if you disprove Daniel Murray, you can discredit Christ and you can disprove Christianity. That's pretty much it. That's why they want to go after Daniel, because he's made about 1,000 prophecies in there which have all taken place. About 1,000 prophecies in that. The whole of history, right from say 600 BC till today, is composed in Daniel. So the 6th century BC dating date can again be vindicated, linguistically speaking. Now, another objection, okay, concerning the language. These guys never get tired. Now, they want to say that Daniel was ignorant of the Gentilic use of the term Babylonian or Chaldean. So, what does that mean? I said that OT prophets used to refer to Babylonians as Chaldeans, okay, except Daniel. Now, this is a false assertion which they are making, because in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel does refer to use the word Chaldeans. Okay, use the word Chaldean to refer to Babylonian citizens. Daniel chapter 1:4, Daniel chapter 5:30, Daniel chapter 9:1. Three references. I just mentioned Daniel chapter 1. Now, another scholar argues that Daniel combines two uses of the word Chaldean when he's talking about it in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapter 5. The people of Chaldea, Kasti, that is one reference of the word, and the other reference of the word Chaldi, meaning to say the astrologers. Okay, so there are two usages of the word. One is called as Kasti, which refers to the people of Chaldea, that is the citizens of Babylon. Okay, that's Kasti, and the astrologers, which is Chaldi. So that's how you answer this objection. Daniel uses the word Kasti to refer to Babylonian or say Chaldean citizens. And the other word Chaldi to refer to say the wise men, astrologers, advisors, etc. in the quote. So simple. And why is that the case? Because only a 6th century BC author could understand this phonetic shift, but not someone from a 2nd century BC date. Simple, because Daniel lived within their den. He could understand quote Aramaic, he could understand the language, and he was brought up in that culture. So he had a better idea about these two different usages of the words. So Daniel's usage of Chaldean could be much closer to the original Babylonian lingo of that day and age. Simple as that. It's not a mistake. Oh, yeah, there are still prophecies in Daniel that are yet to be fulfilled. You are right, Ken Narida, especially the one in Daniel 2. You could say it's partially fulfilled. The kingdom of God is already here, but not yet completely implemented. Okay, now we go on over to the canonical objections. I might take a few pot shots at the Protestant canon if you don't mind, because the best way to explain this thing is not to rely so much on the Hebrew canon, on the Hebrew Masoretic canon. We just have to go more with the Septuagint. So this is the canonical objection. Now, in the Hebrew Bible we see today, Daniel is not placed under the prophets. So just to break it down, the Hebrew Bible is divided into three sections. You have the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, that is Genesis to Deuteronomy. Then you have the prophets or the Nevi'im, Nabi, like in Arabic, we used to use the word Nabi for prophet. Even same thing in Urdu, we use the word Nabi. In Hebrew or Aramaic, they say Navi, and plural it's Naviim. And then you have the writings, which is Ketuvim. Now, Daniel is not placed among the prophets in the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, but instead he's placed in the writings. And now they want to make these claims. Okay. Now, the last prophet in the Old Testament we know as Malachi, who dates to around 450 BC. Now, according to this liberal scholar, he's making an assertion. Samuel Rolls Drives, Rolls Royce, Rolls Drives, funny name. He's making an assertion that the Jewish prophets were supposedly closed, that this canon for the Jewish prophets was supposedly closed around 200 BC. Therefore, Daniel is not in there since Daniel was written, composed around 165 BC. This is again an oversimplified argument. He's just making an assertion saying that they closed the canon at 200 BC. Okay, we'll go with that. the canon of the prophets, not the canon of the writings. But now, which Hebrew canon are we talking about? If you are going into Jesus's own time, there were at least three different Hebrew canons. You had the Pharisaic canon, supposedly the entire Hebrew Bible. I'm saying supposedly the entire Hebrew Bible which we know today. I've just carefully used this word supposedly. I'll come to that why. Then you have the Samaritan canon. They only used to believe in the Torah. Okay. And then you had the Essenes, that is the Jews, the Jewish sect which lived in Qumran. Qumran was where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and they had copies of the Deuterocanon books as well as some of the Apocrypha. Okay, so there were at least three different Jewish canons in circulation, but also if you're talking about the Pharisaic canon, the Pharisaic canon, that was also a problem because they also had the Septuagint, which was the Greek Old Testament. And in Jesus' time, 80 to 90% of the time, Jesus and his apostles, including the New Testament writers who were not as direct apostles, they used to quote from the Greek Old Testament, okay, from the Septuagint. Hey, good evening, Catholic Crusader. Good to see you. And also, Jesus called Daniel a prophet around 30 AD. And this is going to be a problem for them. You know why? I'll again break this argument down. Because what's that guy? Samuel Rolls Royce? What's his name, man? Rolls Drives. Says Malachi was the last prophet. Arguably lived around 500 BC to 450 BC. Roughly around that time. The canon of prophets was closed in 200 BC. So if Malachi was the last prophet, to accept him as a prophet, it could have happened by 200 BC. How much time is that? 450 minus 200? 250 years. Much. So it took at least 250 years for Malachi to be even included as a prophet. Now, this guy says, Samuel Rolls-Royce says, therefore Daniel is late. That is 165 AD. But Jesus around 30 AD says Daniel is a prophet. Okay? And none of the Jews, none of the disciples argue that point with Jesus. Meaning, even the disciples were raised to believe Daniel is a prophet. Now, if I want to do the math from 165 BC, Holy Spirit, please enable me to avoid making mistakes. 165 BC to 30 AD, how much is that? That's less than 200 years. That is less than 200 years. And Jesus is saying in 30 AD, Daniel is a prophet, and the disciples are not arguing. The Jews over there are not arguing. They also agree with that fact, meaning they are raised to believe Daniel is a prophet. So, and that's less than 200 years, which throws this idiot's argument out of the window. He's saying if the canon was closed for prophets in 200 BC, roughly around 200 BC, that means it took them at least 250 years to accept Malachi, who was the last prophet. Okay, but here in less than 200 years, actually much before that, because both Jesus and his apostles were raised to believe Daniel was a prophet right from their childhood. So let's say maybe 100 years. So within 100 years of Daniel's composition, they want to say Daniel was a prophet, which is far too early, which throws this liberal theory out of the window. Was it just Jesus who said Daniel was a prophet? Oh, yeah, Deus Imperator, you're right. I'm coming to that argument. Now, was it Jesus who said Daniel was a prophet? It was not just Jesus. Now, Josephus, Bavius, another first century Jew, who lived one generation after Jesus, also says Daniel is a prophet in his composition in Book 10 of Antiquities of the Jews. And he cites Daniel a lot to explain world history. He just keeps citing Daniel of a lot just to explain world history. Okay. And Josephus wrote Antiquities sometime around, say, 80 to 95 AD, about a generation after Jesus' time. Again, roughly around that time, he's saying that Daniel is a prophet. Now, if you are going to appeal to the early church fathers, early church writers, early church bishops, even they will agree Daniel is a prophet. So, say there is, what's that guy's name? Mileto. Keep forgetting his name. Sorry. Just trying to quote from memory. Yeah. Now, this early church bishop called Mileto, who was the bishop of Sardis, lived from 100 AD to 180 AD. He also considers Daniel a prophet. Okay. Now, this early church writer Origen, 184 to 253 AD, also lists Daniel as a prophet. And he lists Daniel before Ezekiel and the 12 minor prophets, by the way. Usually, if you're reading the Old Testament, that is our Old Testament, we end up listing Isaiah, Jeremiah. Then, after Jeremiah, we list Lamentations, which is a continuation of Jeremiah. Then we list Ezekiel, and then we go to Daniel. But this guy just lists Daniel before Ezekiel and before the 12 minor prophets. Now, just to guys let you know, the Septuagint Old Testament used by the early church lists Daniel among the prophets. And why is that critical over the Hebrew Bible which we have now? So just to give you an overview, I've done this before in one of my earlier videos about the compilation of the Old Testament. We had, say, the Torah, which was given by Moses, probably written in Proto-Hebrew, or say Paleo-Hebrew, around 1400 AD. And then we had other books, maybe which were compiled, say Job, Psalms, Judges, Ruth, probably you could say Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. And parts of the prophets and prophets like Ezekiel, not Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, before 600 BC. That is before the exile. That was the first compilation. Then, during the exile, they would have written Kings 1, Kings 2, Chronicles 1, and then Chronicles 2 towards the end of the exile. Now, note, it's likely they would have written this either using Aramaic, because that was the language in Babylon, or Hebrew as we know it today. using the Aramaic script. The Hebrew we know today, it's actually using the Aramaic script. Just to let you know, I've done that. I'd gone through this in my first video against Esther Dhanraj, the supposed contradictions in the Bible. So the Hebrew alphabet we actually know today, it's the Aramaic alphabet which the Jews picked up. So naturally, when the Jews came back from exile, they would have rewritten the Old Testament using the modern Aramaic Hebrew script. Okay, between say 500 BC to 400 BC, all the way. Now, we don't have any of these manuscripts to let you know. We don't have any of these manuscripts which were written in Hebrew around this time period. We don't have any of them. Now, after Alexander the Great came across, like Alexander's conquest and Hellenization, Koine Greek became the international language of Alexander's conquered territories. So it was the English of that day, which resulted in Jews who got influenced by Hellenistic culture, who were speaking Greek, traveling around internationally. To some of them also used to get into things like proselytization, that is winning converts among Gentiles. But to do that, they wanted to know Greek. And for Greek to be understood, they decided to get, legend has it, about 70 or 72 different scholars, Jewish scholars, and they compiled the Old Testament in Greek, and that is called as the Septuagint Old Testament. Which is called as the Septuagint. Now, Septuagint means, anyone? What does the word Septuagint mean? Any ideas? Any ideas? What does the word Septuagint mean? Yep, it means 70. Therefore, whenever we use Septuagint, we say LXX. Oh, Aladdin, good to see you, Aladdin. Welcome. Which is 70 Roman numeral. L usually means 50 and double XX means 20. So if we add that up, we'll get 70. That's the Septuagint. Okay, so it got compiled around this time, roughly 250 BC. Some people say it may be closer to 300 BC, but I'll just take a more conservative date, or say 150 BC. So we had the Greek Old Testament in parallel to Hebrew copies of that time. However, the Greek variants got more popular and had become the standard during Jesus' time. That Jesus, his apostles, and also anti-writers like Paul, James, Luke, John, etc. used to quote from the Septuagint 80 to 90% of the time. Are you getting this, guys? So they just used to quote this 80 to 90% of the time. So this was the Old Testament which the early church used to appeal to. Since the apostles used to use this was the thing among the Jews and the Greeks. So this was the Old Testament the early church used to appeal to. And if you read the Dewey Rheims Bible, or maybe say the Orthodox Study Bible, the Old Testament of the Orthodox Study Bible, it's a direct translation of the Septuagint manuscripts of their time, and the Latin Vulgate is also very similar. It corresponds to the Septuagint very closely. Okay, that is the Dewey Rheims. This was the Bible in use by the church for the first 1500 years. But just to take note, the Latin Vulgate was based on the Hebrew, with some places it used things in the Septuagint as well, but it was mostly based on the Hebrew, but not the Hebrew which we see among the Masoretes and the rabbinic Jews today. It was the Hebrew which used to predate that. It was the Hebrew which you will see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's more closer to that one. All right. So coming back over here, the Septuagint Old Testament used by the early church does list Daniel as a prophet. Okay. So going back to the next point. So yeah, just a bit of a bummer for Protestants if they just want to go about discussing, defending Daniel using the Hebrew canon, then they do run into a few issues with respect to this objection, with respect to the canonical objection. The other stuff is fine. No offense to Protestants, but I'm just trying to stay more in line with the early church. But just to say that if it was written early, I just made that point that Samuel Rolls Drives is not consistent in the light of the evidence, given the time it took for Daniel to become a prophet, if you're assuming a 165 BC date within the 100 years. And now the earliest Septuagint mentions of Daniel date back to 132 BC in Alexandria in Egypt. Now, if I'll just subtract 132 and 165 BC, that's roughly about 30 years. Okay, about 30 years. Deus Imperator, the Orthodox Study Bible, the New Testament uses the New King James, but the Old Testament is a translation of the Septuagint. Okay. Why did this translation happen so fast then? Within 30 years, that's like a first generation copy then. Within 30 years, it's just like one generation. And given that time during the Maccabean era, the Jews were under persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jews were under serious persecution by Antiochus. Hey, Janice, God bless you. See you later. And why is it that within a generation, if it was supposedly written in 165, that it lands up in Egypt, which is miles away? That argument just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold any water. Daniel has to be written much prior. Because if you're saying the Septuagint was compiled by 150 BC, are you saying that they decided to translate it as soon as it was written? That doesn't make any sense. Okay, now one more scholar. I think he's the biggest defender of Daniel, Jonathan McClatchy. He's a high Anglican. I respect his work. One of the sources I'm referring to is actually his own literature review of the evidence, the objections against Daniel, the evidence for Daniel. However, he thinks that the evidence from the Septuagint is weak because it contains Daniel 14. But now, if you happen to be Catholic or Orthodox or Church of the East, we won't really bother because in our Old Testament, in our Bibles, we'll have Daniel 14, Bel and the Dragon. So for us, it's not a problem. Although some scholars and coming later, they just claim that it could have been a later addition. But even then, I don't think that this is really weak evidence for an early date. But some people will just say, why is Daniel among the writings then? Why is Daniel still among the writings? I haven't answered that question. All I've made this case is, hey, good to see you, brethren. I've just made the case that Daniel is a prophet. But then what is it doing in the writings then in the Hebrew Bible? Now, some people can just use this poor or weak argument saying, Elijah, Elisha, they were prophets, but their work is in the writings. But you forget that the work of Elijah and Elisha, it's distributed in First Kings and Kings too, much like earlier prophets, like say Moses and Abraham and stuff. They had their stuff distributed up across different books. Whereas when we are talking about the three major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, they had an entire book after their name. Okay. So that's not a really good argument. So it still begs the question, what is Daniel doing in the writings of the Jews? And the reason is, according to some, this could be a late change, and there is evidence to suggest that this is a late change. Okay, so just to let you guys know, coming back here, the Septuagint was preserved by the early church. Just to let you know, the Septuagint Old Testament over the Hebrew. As for the Hebrew, you could say Jerome translated Hebrew manuscripts which possibly dated to say 200 to say 350 AD to Latin. Okay, Jerome had earlier used the Septuagint, but changed his mind probably after, I guess, Augustine or somebody influenced him. So the Western Church had the Latin Vulgate. The Eastern Church, which was a translation from Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament, whereas the Eastern Church had a completely Greek Bible, Greek Septuagint, OT, and Greek NT. All right, that is, as we know, that's the Orthodox Church today, the Eastern Church. The Western Church is the Catholic Church, and by extension, Protestant Church, which is a daughter of Catholicism at the end of the day. So I hope I'm not boring you guys so much with this history lesson, but around say 400 AD or so, could have even been before that, possibly earlier, our rabbinic Jews started introducing some subtle corruptions in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament. Why? Reject Christianity and Christ as King and God, King, Messiah, and Jehovah. These reasons. Okay. Okay, cool. Good to hear the feedback. Yes, it was all related to messianic prophecies because if you see the earliest Masoretic, not the earliest Masoretic, the completely preserved Hebrew Bible, which we have now, which is from the Masoretic text, they have Daniel in the writings. And they have inserted the vowels in the wrong places in certain Psalms and certain prophecies, which have got to do with the Messiah. Okay, so, and the sad part is that Protestants try to appeal to the Hebrew canon, but when matters like Daniel, generally that's not a problem, but in matters like Daniel, it can be something which shoots you in the foot. If you just stick to the Septuagint and the early church tradition, you're good. However, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls has vindicated even the book of Isaiah. It's vindicated the book of Isaiah from modern liberal scholars. It's also vindicated the book of Isaiah from the Masoretic corruptions which these guys have discovered. And the objections people used to bring against the Septuagint, which were coming from the rabbinic Jews, according to them, the church corrupted the Old Testament by including the Septuagint. We Jews have the correct Bible. After the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, that really put a slap on their face. But we have people like Rabdul Takya Swinger who still use that argument. And unfortunately, I've also seen uninformed Protestants or fundamentalists using that argument without having any idea about what they are talking about concerning the Septuagint. It's really fun that disappointing, but that's fine. Even lots of Catholics on the whole are uninformed. Lots of Orthodox on the whole are uninformed, so that's fine. So now, how does Gleason Archer try to say that what is Daniel doing in the writings? Now, he hypothesizes that maybe the Masoretic Jews uh, were very overzealous. Okay, they were very overzealous, and they would have thought maybe Daniel belongs in the writings because Daniel prophesied directly to the Gentiles and served under Gentile courts. This is the same argument you'll be hearing rabbinic Jews using. This is a very poor argument. Daniel did not serve the Jewish people or prophesy directly to them. Like Joseph, he is an inspired seer. Seer means a person who can see into the future, not just speak of the future, since Daniel could see visions of the future. And that's why he was called as a seer who can see the future. But he used to see the future helping, foreign monarchs, foreign kings, like the Babylonians and the Persians and all these people. He was of no benefit to the Jews. Now, to tell you the truth, this is just blasphemy. But so, out of all due respect for Gleason Archer, I cannot agree with him here with his assessment concerning the Masoretic Jews being overzealous, partly because it's his Protestant bias kicking in. That's what I think. And you know why? Daniel is in the writings for these reasons. Because if you're saying Daniel spoke and preached only to the Gentiles, then that's wrong. Because you had prophet Jonah who only spoke only to the Gentiles, the Assyrians. Did he give any prophecy to Israel? No. Is it written? No. That is a poor argument. Now, the Joseph in the Old Testament is also a prophet, since he happened to prophesy about his brothers, his fathers, and his father's wife, that is Leah, serving him. That when he had seen the dream about the sun and the moon and the stars bowing, and the sheaves in the farm bowing to his sheaf, that kind of thing. And also, Joseph, sorry, I have a typo here. Sorry about that, not Josephus. So, moreover, Joseph did not tell the king of Egypt about future empires after him, but Daniel did so. This is the comparison. Daniel not only prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar about his well being, he also talked about what's going to happen after him, including world history. Now, Daniel also talked about many things that could happen to Israel, especially what's happening in Daniel 9. And Daniel 9 is one place where rabbinic Jewish scholars are really scared about and they want to tap dance. Daniel 9:24 to 27. Because it talks about so many things. It talks about the arrival of the Messiah. It talks about the death of the Messiah. It talks about the destruction of the temple, of the second temple. Okay, and it also talks about the end of the Jewish of rather the Jews getting dispersed after the destruction of the second temple. All these things are there. Now, this prophecy, like Isaiah 53, is another nightmare to Jews. Daniel 9:24 to 27, the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. Okay, there are reasons why the Jews have put this in the writings. Okay, however, they were just this is just my personal opinion. You are free to disagree with it, like both Protestants and also conservative Protestant scholars. Out of all due respect, Gleason Archer, I admire him for a lot of things. Even Jonathan McClatchy ought to stop appealing to the current Hebrew canon and the Masoretic manuscripts to deny the Deuterocanon. Simple, because the Septuagint it has the Deuterocanon. As simple as that. And why did people reject the Deuterocanon? Only because it didn't agree with their theology. They thought it was too quote unquote Catholic. And then they come up with objections concerning historical mistakes in the Deuterocanon and so on and so forth. And they won't apply that charity. When people talk about the Masoretic texts and mistakes and scribal issues and historical mistakes over there, then you'll be seeing Christian apologists, mostly Protestant apologists, going over the top. And at that point of time, they start appealing to the Septuagint to vindicate some of the scribal errors and things like that, or also the Dead Sea Scrolls. But when asked to apply the same amount of charity to the Deuterocanon, I didn't see that consistency. But this is one place where where a person would still be stumped. What is Daniel doing in the writings? If you just stick with the Septuagint and the early church, fine, your thing is answered. You don't have to do a lot of explaining concerning this. And this was kind of approved. And Muslim apologists also kind of say that Paul misquoted certain things in Psalms, but Paul was quoting like particularly Psalm 40 verse 6, that is Psalm 39 verse 7 in the Septuagint. Paul was actually quoting the Septuagint paraphrase of Psalm 40 verse 6 concerning a messianic prophecy which Jesus fulfilled. So if you know the Septuagint, you'll be able to answer that question. If you're appealing to the Masoretic Hebrew, then you won't be able to answer that question. I could discuss that later in another video. Now, another objection which people want to make about Daniel is the theology is too late, it is too advanced. Now, I know that most of you guys here know your Bible very well. This is not much of a problem to you guys who understand things like messianic prophecy, the angel of the Lord Christology, and all these things. For us, it's not much of a big problem. For those of you who don't know, they get taken aback by these kind of things because Daniel explicitly talks about the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment in chapter 12. And now scholars want to assert, liberal scholars want to assert, that this is similar to the intertestamental and the apocryphal literature you'll find in books like Enoch, 3rd and 4th Esdras, Maccabees 1 and 2, because Maccabees 2 especially talks about the resurrection of the dead in one of the earlier chapters, where a woman and 7 of her sons get killed by the Syrians because they believed in the resurrection of the dead and they could not recant their Jewish faith. And then there are also messianic themes like the Son of Man, like in Daniel 7:13 to 14. Now, the Son of Man is talked about in Enoch, which they say is an apocryphal book written maybe around between 200 and say 50, 200 BC and say 50 BC. And then you have Esdras 3 and Esdras 4 also, which is written around that point of time. Some Bibles would coin Esdras 3 and Esdras 4 as Esdras 1 and Esdras 2. But some Bibles would just say Nehemiah as Ezra as Esdras 1, Nehemiah as Esdras 2. This is Esdras 3 and Esdras 4. So this nomenclature changes depending on which Bible you're looking at. And there are too many references of angels delivering messages, showing visions, things, so on and so forth. So Daniel's theology is too advanced. It's more like New Testament theology. It is late. Okay. So if I'm going to these books, they're saying Daniel is late, but now it's not really the case. Now, say the book of the prophet Zechariah, it's got a lot of messianic prophecies. There's Zechariah 2, there's Zechariah 3, there's Zechariah 13, lots of messianic prophecies all over the place, as well as references to angels, like especially the angel of the Lord. And now the problem they have here is even liberal scholars date Zechariah to around 520 BC to 470 BC. And 520 BC is roughly the time you could say Daniel died. So this is very close to Daniel's time period, despite Zechariah having all these so-called advanced themes. Now Job, which predates maybe even the writing of the Pentateuch, it has the resurrection of the dead. In Job 19:25 to 27, I could just read out that verse for you. Just a second, guys. Job 19:25 to 27. I'm just using the New King James Version. Whoops, my bad. So, and Job is here. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God. In my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me. Job is talking about his own resurrection, and this ties in very closely with First Thessalonians chapter 6, verses 14 to 16. Paul is talking about seeing God. Sorry, did I spell Thessalonians correctly? What's wrong with this thing? How is Thessalonian spelled, guys? This is what I want to see. First Thessalonians 6, I think, is it? Was it First Thessalonians or was it? Oh, my bad. It was First Timothy. Sorry. First Timothy 6. Here he is. Paul, verses 13 to 16. I urge you in the sight of God, who gives life to all things, and before Christ Jesus, who witnessed a good confession before Pontius Pilate, that you keep this commandment without spot, blameless, until our Lord Jesus Christ appearing, which he will manifest in his own time, he who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, dwelling in unapproachable light again, whom no man has seen or can see, to whom be honor and everlasting power. Amen. So it's very similar to what Job is talking about in Job 19:25 to 27, that he will be able to see God at last in the flesh. Rather, after he resurrects, he is be able to see God as he is. And then you have Psalm 16, verse 10, which Peter clarifies about the resurrection of the dead. Now, Psalms 16, verse 10, it's a Davidic psalm, so it's attributed to be written sometime around 1000 to 970 BC, which is another very early date. And Peter quotes that in Acts 2 at the first Pentecost when he's speaking to the Jews concerning Jesus being resurrected from the dead, of how he will not leave the soul of his, how he'll not leave the soul of his Holy One to be in Sheol and his flesh to be corrupted. His flesh will be incorruptible. Just to paraphrase what it says. Then Isaiah 26:19 also talks about the resurrection of the dead, and liberal scholars date this section of Isaiah to 750 BC to 650 BC, in other words, 200 years before the time of Daniel, and say 500 years before the so-called Maccabean dating of Daniel, which is again way too early. Now, if you know Malachi 3 and 4, which is dated to, now Malachi is again dated to say roughly 450 BC. Let you guys know. Oops, sorry guys. Now Malachi is also dated to around 450 BC, and you know Malachi 3 verse 1, that's a messianic prophecy about Jehovah coming to his temple and the messenger of the covenant, John the Baptist, going before him. And Malachi 4, that is the last chapter of Malachi, it talks about the New Testament. Sorry, not the New Testament. It talks about the final judgment and the second coming of Jesus Christ, the day of the Lord. Again, that's talking about that. So it's nothing new. It's been consistent in the Bible. Now, Ezekiel also alludes to some physical resurrection of the dead. He makes a reference, although over there he's just seen a vision, which he's talking about Israel who are dead being renewed, the skeletons rising up from the graves, giving flesh and bones, and then rising up, which was another prophecy of them returning back from exile. But it could also be a prefiguring of the actual resurrection of the dead and also the new Israel, the church. And then you have angels mentioned all over the place besides the angel of the Lord in the Torah. You have the angel mentioned in Joshua. Then you have another angel of the Lord mentioned in Judges chapter 13. Then you have angel of the Lord in books of Samuel and Kings and Chronicles, Ezekiel. It's throughout the thing, all these angelic references. So this is a weak objection if you know your Old Testament that Daniel's theology is quote unquote too advanced. All right, guys. Just stop sharing. So, guys, I hope you guys have been edified with this session. And no offense to my Protestant brethren, actually, I'm just calling a spade. Sometimes you are free to agree to disagree with me, but I don't see any other way out of it, out of that objection. If you want to say why is Daniel still in the writings, the best way it can be explained is using the canon used by the Church, the Catholic and the Orthodox, with respect to the Old Testament. And please pray for me, guys, and pray for each other. And much appreciated if you guys can just do a favor, just share this video around, invite more folks. I want my subs to go up in a way so that more people get to know this information. God is glorified. It's not for me, not for people's approval or people approving, praising me, or things so on and so forth. It's just that there's so much of venom out there in the internet, so much of poison out there in scholarship that truth is hardly found. So it just this, and you guys are just free to translate it, upload it on your own channels, and just share this material with your friends or in your church circles. Thank you so much, guys. God bless you all. God willing, I'll see you day after tomorrow. Take care.